as we know, especially the career of Avraham Avinu. We met him briefly at the end of last week's Parasha, but we learn a lot more about him and his experiences, people in his life today. I mean, in this week's Parasha, and we're going to learn tonight. So I'd like to start, and I have to say that I had to be very selective because there's so many fascinating passages in my friend for the year, ha-Ketav ve-Kabbalah. He writes in a way at greater length and in greater detail than Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz. So there's a lot to choose from. So let's get started. We're looking at Perek Yud Dalet, Pasuk Yud Gimel, so chapter 14, verse 13. And what I like to share with you initially is the meaning of the well-known expression, Ve'avo ha-palit ve'aged la-Avram ha-Ivri. Avraham Avinu, our father Abraham, is called Avraham ha-Ivri. And the derivation of the term Avraham ha-Ivri is the subject to different possibilities. I'm just looking here in the ArtScroll translation. Then there came the fugitive and told Abraham the Ivri. So the ArtScroll doesn't give much away in that regard, the Ivri. In the footnote there in the ArtScroll, it mentions some possibilities. Let me tell you what ha-Ketav ve-Kabbalah says about it. And he's following the Medrash, which says there are three possible derivations. It could be that he's Mibnei Eved. That's maybe the simplest explanation, although as we'll see, he's going to critique it in a moment. The simplest explanation would be that he is a descendant of Ever. Ever was the grandson or possibly great-grandson of Shem, which means that he was one of the ancestors of Abraham, not his father, not his grandfather, goes back several generations. But Abraham was a descendant of Ever, and therefore Avraham ha-Ivri is from the household, like you have a patronym, a person, especially if he's descended from someone distinguished. So he might utilize his descent from that important personage as his patronym, as I say, is the name by which he's known and can become a family name. That's one possibility mentioned in the Medrash. Another, and they're of course not mutually exclusive. A second explanation is the geography. He comes me'ever hanahar, from the other side of the river. And therefore, it's very commonplace that a person is known by his place of origin. And in Jewish terms, this was very common because Jews frequently went from place to place. And if a boy studies in a certain yeshiva, so he can be known by the name of his hometown. Or a Rav who serves in a certain town can be known and associated with, like the Panovizh Rav. He was in Panovizh for a certain period of his life. He was elsewhere for many other years, but he became known as the Panovizh Rav. This, of course, is very normal. So he says, Avraham ha-Ivri, because he came me'ever lanahar. Ever means the side, the other side of the river. And again, this is certainly true. He came from Aram Naharaim. Aram Naharaim means between the rivers, Aram, between the rivers. And that is the Fertile Crescent or Mesopotamia. And he came me'ever lanahar. Okay, and that is why we have the word Ivrit, because according to ha-Ketav ve-Kabbalah, the people initially spoke Lashon HaKodesh. This is hinted to in last week's Parasha, the Tower of Babel, where it says that the people had a single language and Safa Achat, one language. And Rashi says the language was Lashon HaKodesh, the Hebrew tongue. But as a result of the confusion that Hashem imposed upon them, their languages became confused. They could not converse with one another, they cannot communicate with one another, and they each went their separate ways, speaking their different languages. He suggests that the people in that particular area, maybe where the Tower of Babel was first built, they retained the Hebrew language, and that's why it's called Ivrit, which again is reasonable enough. But he says for sure the primary reason is a third reason, and that is a theological reason. The whole world was on one side of the river, or not really the river, but was on one side of the equation, and he was on the other side. He says that the Medrash says that theologically, Avraham stood on the other side. He stood in opposition to the paganism and to the polytheism, to the idolatry that was the order of the day, the order of the era. Abraham was the first monotheist, and he was the iconoclast. He was one who smashed the idols. He was like the Far Side, for those who remember the American cartoon, The Far Side. So probably his antagonists regarded him as representing the far side. He was far out. He was way out. He was out on a limb. He was on one side of the world and on the theological debate, and the whole world was on the other side. And ha-Kabbalah says, actually, this makes a lot of sense because the word aver, side, is used in the sense of two sides of a dispute. Like you've got Brown versus the Board of Education. I apologize, my primary and secondary education was in the USA. There may be a comparable landmark cases here in Britain. One of our lawyers can fill me in. But I remember Brown versus the Board of Education, I think it was in the 1950s, about segregation. We've got Roe versus Wade, which is about abortion. Or you've got Kramer versus Kramer, which is not in the Supreme Court. It was a movie in 1979. So the idea of versus, that is to say, opposing sides of a dispute, they're called, the word aver can easily be used and correctly be used to someone who seizes or adapts one side of a debate. And in this case, it was Abraham against the world. So that's why he was known as Avraham ha-Ivri. Says the ha-Kabbalah, there's no question, says that this is the principal reason that Abraham is the only one in the world, and he stands against and in opposition to those who deny the God of Israel or the whole idea of monotheism, and therefore he is known as Avraham ha-Ivri. He says that the suggestion that it's geographical, he said this is very weak because he says when it comes to the like a family name, to say a person is descended from a certain distinguished ancestor, he said that would be reasonable if the ancestor was a person of prominence, a person who is renowned. But Aver is not renowned at all. He's hardly mentioned in the Torah, only very briefly. We have a rabbinic tradition, which I'm sure the learned audience tonight is familiar with, that there was the yeshiva of Shem ve'Aver, but that's part of the Torah Shebaal Peh. The Torah itself would have no natural reason to say Avraham is known as ha-Ivri because he's descended from Aver, the distinguished Aver, the well-known Aver. It's not true. It's just the opposite. We say that like Kish Avi Shaul, Kish, there was a man named Kish. It's not real men don't eat Kish, but Kish was the father of Shaul, and the pasuk says, the pasuk in Shmuel says he was the father of Shaul because Shaul is well known. He was the king. Kish, his father, was not as well known, less known. He was really known only as the father of Shaul. So Abraham is very well known. Aver is not well known at all. Certainly the Torah, as we know, we're just discussing tonight, has so much about Avraham Avinu, so it doesn't make sense to say that Avram is known, he's identified as descended from Aver, when Aver is not anyone important, except that he's the ancestor of Avraham. So it's back to front as far as that goes. The geographical location as well is also weak because there are a lot of people who came from there. As I said, it's the Fertile Crescent. Mesopotamia is the cradle of civilization. There is so much, I mean, even to this day, thousands of years later, archaeologists are making fascinating discoveries from that part of the world because it was one of the earliest parts of the world to be settled by advanced a man who wandered out of Africa, whenever that may have been, without getting into the paleontology of it. So there are many who came from Aver HaNahar, and there are many who descended from Aver, but Aver is not an important person anyway. So therefore, the main reason is that Avram is called Avraham ha-Ivri because of his theological distinction. But he adds that the Chachamim, the sages, were just observing that the name Avraham ha-Ivri also reflects his descent from Aver and also reflects his origins from Aver HaNahar, from the other side of the river. But of course, the real significant reason for that designation of a kagonim, of Avraham ha-Ivri, is, of course, because of his theological position, and that was groundbreaking, and we'll have a chance, I think, tonight, possibly, to reflect on that further as well. Now, I want to explore again, I keep saying it, but it's always true, novel and creative, different approach to a well-known like declaration on the part of our father Avraham, And you'll find it if you just turn, if you got my Chumash, if you turn the page, I'm in this, the Art Scroll Stone Chumash, page 64. So Avraham had the pasuk that we've been discussing until now is where the fugitive comes to Avraham and he tells him that his nephew Lot has been captured. So in this kind of world war, the 4 kings against the 5 kings, a regional war. So Avraham joins the battle. He rescues Lot. And along the way, he brings back all the booty and all of the loot and all of the plunder, and he wants to return it, and he does return it to the king of Sedom. So take a look with me in chapter 14, verse 22. The king says, actually, verse 21, give me the people, and that is to say, return my subjects to me, the people that you've rescued, you've freed them from their captivity. And the property, kachlach, you take. To the victor go the spoils. That's what the king of Sedom says to Avraham. Says Avraham in response, Avram el melech Sedom, harimosi adi el Hashem kel elyon konei shamayim va'aretz. I raise my hand to the Most High God, the master of heaven and earth. If I take a thread or a shoelace or a shoe strap, if I take anything that belongs to you, lest you say, you shall not say, I made Avram wealthy. Now, this, as I say, is a strong, very kind of a dramatic, emphatic statement which reflects Abraham's nobility of spirit. He doesn't want to take handouts. He doesn't want to take freebies. He doesn't even want to take, like I said a moment ago, to the victor go the spoils. He doesn't want to take it. He ran the country. He's returning everything. But he lifts up his hand. Now, Rashi says that he is making an oath. Rashi says, let's take a look at Rashi. He says, Harimosidi lashon shavua. This is an expression of an oath. Mirimani asyadi lakeledion. I'm raising my hand like in a court of law when you give witness, you raise your hand to testify. Mirimani asyadi laeledion. Okay, that's what Rashi, very well known. Says ha-Kabbalah, a very good question. He says, what is going on here? He says, was the rechush, was the spoil, the booty, so precious in the eyes of Avraham that he had to take an oath to prevent himself from stretching out his hand to take it? Like Rashi says elsewhere, tzadikim mashbim es yitzram, that the righteous take an oath to rein in their yitzra hara, to prevent themselves from doing something they don't want to do, but they're worried they may be tempted. So he takes an oath. Is that the case of the Abraham? Did he regard as so important, as so valuable, as so precious the booty, the wealth, the spoils of war, that he has to take an oath to say, I won't take any? He says, to me, it would seem as if this oath would nearly be a shvuas shav. It would almost be a pointless oath, an oath which is almost in vain, because who would have ever thought? Avraham himself would surely have never contemplated seizing them because it's so precious to him. He covets it so much. It belongs to the people of Sedom. He'll return it to Sedom. As we say in Yeshiva, what's the Hava Amina? And this is a very good question, I think, which, to be honest, I had never thought of. I mean, I shouldn't. Sorry if you lost me there. I should have thought of it, but I never did. Maybe you did. I never thought of this good question, obvious question. Says Harimosi Adi, because I was going with Rashi. Harimosi Adi. He could say whatever he says without Harimosi Adi. What is the meaning of I lift my hand? Rashi says that's Lashon Shavua. I'm not saying Rashi is mistaken, but I'm just observing that one can question Rashi's approach as we have seen right now. What does it mean then? Beautiful approach. Says ha-Kabbalah. He says that Harimosias Yadi, I lift up my hand. It's like we say in the Song of the Sea, Elohei Aviv Aromamenhu, the God of my father, and I will exalt him. Aromamenhu. Harimosias Yadi is an expression of Romamus Hashir v'Hashevach. It's the exalted song and praise. Harimosias Yadi means I raise my hand in praise of God. Yadi is an expression like Todah. It's an expression of Hoda'ah, admission. It's like you say, I put up my hands because I have nothing, no response, or I acknowledge the righteousness of your cause. Harimosi is yadi. He says yadi is like lashon hoda'ah, todah, to admit or to acknowledge. Harimosi, I lift up my hands. It's an expression of shevach, lakel, a praise to God who has enriched me. Hashem has showered wealth upon me, and I don't have to take from basar v'dam. I don't have to take from another person because Hashem has enriched me. And he says, according to this, when it says, take another look at the pasuk, because the language here is noteworthy. Harimosi yadi, it's in, again, pasuk Chav Beis, verse 22. Harimosi yadi, I lift up my hand, and we've said it means, it's an expression of praise. I raise my hand in praise. I'm grateful to Hashem. I praise Hashem. I thank God. He's the master of heaven and earth, that I don't have a need to take anything. He says that I have no need to take. I'm praising God that I have no need to take from a person. And if you say, which many of the Meforshim ask, but it's a kasha on Rashi as well, it's kashari on the pasuk itself. If you say, but what about Paro? Didn't Avraham take from Paro? So he doesn't say it here, ha-Kabbalah, but he says it there earlier in the Parasha. He claims that Avraham did not take from Paro. Paro did not enrich Avraham. It says that when it says that, if you look closely, it says that Avraham had wealth. It doesn't say Paro gave him the wealth. He understands it to mean Avraham had wealth already. What Paro did for Avraham is he didn't seize his wealth. He didn't plunder his wealth. He didn't take it from him. It's like years ago, about 10 years ago, when we had that terrible recession. I saw a cartoon in the December time. The boss says to his employee, this year's bonus, you get to keep your job. So the fact that Paro didn't take Avraham's property from him, that was the gift that he gave him. He didn't enrich him, and Avraham would not have taken from Paro. He did not take from Paro, and he doesn't take from the king of Sedom either. Harimosia said he means Romamus Shevach v'Shir, Shir v'Shevach, song and praise. But then he says something different entirely. He says all of this is in accordance with what the rabbis say in the Medrash. Excuse me, even though Rashi, as I said, is a well-known Medrash, but the Medrash also says, Harimosi yes yadi lashon elokei avi va'aroma menhu. But then he says something else entirely. He says, you know what? He says, Lule divrehim shel chazal, if it were not for the words of the sages, I've got another approach entirely. He says, it's like the expression, Herim yad b'melech, Harimosi yes yadi, I lift up my hand, Harimosi yadi el Hashem, I lifted my hand against God. Avraham says that if I were to take from you, it would be as if I were raising my hand against God. Like the Pasuk says, Herim yad b'melech. He raised his hand against the king, Lashon merida, an expression of insurrection, of rebellion. The meaning is that it would be merida gedol, it would be a great rebellion against the master of the universe if I were to take something from you, the king of Sedom, and it would be as if I'm putting my trust in man rather than in God. So harimosi yadi lekel elyon, it would be considered, if you're saying, king of Sedom, that I should return the captives and seize the booty, seize the spoils, such a thing would be an act of rebellion against God if I were to do that. It's as if I am putting my trust and I'm relying on people to bring about my prosperity and my security and my success. And he says that Harimosi yadi el Hashem is like al Hashem, against God, as we find. We read it in Parashas Bereshis. Vayakam Kayin el Hevel achi vayahargehu. Cain stood up against his brother Hevel and he killed him. It says Vayakam Kain el Hevel achi. usually El means to, but it can also mean against. And we find that in many places, such as that instance. So therefore, Avraham, according to ve-ha-Kabbalah, Avraham says to the king of Sedom, who had proposed, take the spoils, seize the spoils of war, he said it would be considered like an act of rebellion against God. Harimosi adi El Hashem, it would be as if I was rebelling against God if I were to do that. If I took anything from you. And according to this, we don't have to understand it like Rashi, who says that I will not take. Imekach means if I were to take anything from you, it would be considered like a rebellion against God. Shelo velo tomar means so that you will not say that. You don't have to interpret it, as I said, as if Avraham is rejecting that means to say that I won't take, meaning if I'm taking an oath not to take, but rather I am. It would be considered like a rebellion against God if I were to take anything from you. So according to this, Avraham's nobility of spirit shines through. Not that he has to take an oath about the matter, but either he's praising God that I have no need to take from man, or he's saying, perhaps even more, a sharper approach, that it would be considered rebellion against God, that I'm relying on man instead of on Hashem, the master of the universe. Finally, I want to share with you another comment later on in the Parasha, and I find this again not only interesting but also I found it interesting. I hope you do as well. It's all interesting, but I found this to be an excellent manifestation, like an example of his style, the style of ve-ha-Kabbalah. Some of you may know, I hope you do, that the style of ve-ha-Kabbalah, Rabbi Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg, is, as the name of his book implies, the text and the tradition, to demonstrate the interconnectedness between the rabbinic interpretation and the Torah itself. That is to say, he demonstrates how the rabbinic elaboration or the midrashic tradition is not just a kind of speculative, maybe imaginative elaboration on the text of the Torah, which involves a kind of flight of fancy or poetic license, but rather it is a result of a thorough and an exacting attention to the nuances of the text. And I think you will agree that that is the right way to read any text in which we pay close attention to it, at least a text which is worthy of our devotion and has, of course, not only captivated the attention, but is the lifeblood of the Jewish people. Naturally, we pay close attention to it. So let me tell you what he says about chapter 16, verse 4. So here we have a simple few words, simple in that they would appear to be similar to what we find in many other places in the Torah. Chapter 16, verse 4. Sarai, Avram's wife, has been, they've been married. We don't know how long they've been married, actually, but presumably for quite some time. And they are barren. He is childless. She is childless. They are childless. And the Torah says in the beginning of the chapter, Sarai Avram lo yalda lo, she did not bear a child to him. But she had an Egyptian maidservant, and her name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Avram, Hashem has inhibited me, has prevented me from giving birth. Therefore, I am giving you my maidservant, and perhaps if she bears a child, I, in a surrogate manner, will be built up through her. Okay, this is well known, and the Torah is going to describe what happens later. But there's a turn of phrase which ve-ha-Kabbalah analyzes. In verse 4, Pasuk Dalet. Ve'avo el Hagar vatahar. He consorted with her, and she conceived. Okay, and what follows is again of great interest, but because we find a conflict between them. But I just want to share with you what he says about vatahar, vayavo el Hagar vatahar. So if you take a look at Rashi, for those who have Rashi's parish, Rashi says vayavo el Hagar vatahar mibia rishona. From the first act of intercourse, she conceived. Now, this comment of Rashi is well known, may not be among his most memorable or dramatic comments, but maybe a Rishona. So to be honest, again, in my simplicity, I understood this comment of Rashi to reflect the fact that the sages were not comfortable with the idea that our father Abraham should be consorting with this Egyptian maidservant night after night over the course of weeks or months. And therefore, they suggest that she conceived right away, and perhaps they had no further need for any marital intimacy. Could well be. But where is the indication in the text itself? Rashi says, maybe Arishana. How do we know that? And again, I would have been at a loss to understand or to find the indication for it. Taking a closer look, though, do you notice in Pasuk Dalet, Vayavo el Hagar vatahar? This is a sequence of words that follows one upon the other. Normally, when the Torah speaks of conception, it says Vayavo eleha, and that's the end of the pasuk. He consorted with her. That's the end of the verse. The next pasuk says Vatahar, and she conceived Vatele ben, and she bore a child. We have that in the Torah many times. But again, although I had not been alert to it, it always says Vayavo eleha is the end of the pasuk. The next pasuk says Vatahar. There's no indication, therefore, generally, that she conceived right away. It could have been after weeks or months. Here it says Vayavo eleha Vatahar, a sequence of words with no interruption. In fact, the ta'amim, the cantillation notes imply that it was immediate. And of course, that was the whole purpose of his interest in her in the first place. And therefore, he says that this is the source of how the sages had that idea. He says that it's very uncommon to find it. The other place where we do find that idea that I'll just read it to you because it says later on, if you want to take a look, it's chapter 38, verse 18. It says, with regarding to Yehuda and Tamar, Vayavo eleha vataharlo. He came to her and she conceived by him. That's referring to Yehuda and Tamar. Now you will recall, of course, that Tamar, who was the daughter-in-law of Yehuda, except that his two sons had both died and she was twice widowed, Tamar contrived to attract his attention, and she disguised herself. And as a result, he did not even know who she was. We'll discuss that when we get to it. But there it says, Vayavo eleha vataharlo. And of course, there was only once because he only consorted with her on that one occasion when she became pregnant. So therefore, it's all in one pasuk, Vayavo eleha vataharlo. But in all other instances where the Torah describes the sequence of events, to me, the implication is, don't imagine that, in biblical times or in the biblical examples that the conception was always right away. Fertility was something that happened automatically. Many people, the Torah tells us, then and now have challenges when it comes to fertility. And to me, this is a kind of, I guess, a subtle reminder that not every couple have the experience of conception, which is, happens readily on the first time, etc. That's why Rashi says, but maybe a Rishona, this was notable. In the case of Abraham, also, I suppose it implies that, maybe Abraham was himself capable of fathering children, although they had together been barren for a long time, etc. But in any case, says ve-ha-Kabbalah, we'll end with this, just to conclude with the last words. He says his last comment is Re'ei ki medrashei chachamenu b'kur hadikduk mezukhakim. See that the interpretations of our sages are refined in the crucible of dikduk. They emerge from a lucid and a clear and an exacting analysis of the dikduk, of the precision, of the grammatical, and here it's even the ta'amim, even the cantillation notes. And again, this reflects an idea that I mentioned it already, that his objective is to refute the rise of reform in his time, which sought to validate, although they moved on from that as well, but to validate the written Torah and to disenfranchise the Torah Shebaal Peh. And he wants to show how the two are not only inseparable, but the Torah Shebaal Peh, the rabbinic interpretation, flows directly and logically from the language and the precise understanding of the Torah itself. For those who will be with us on Shabbos, we're going to speak about the rise of reform as well, because we'll see how, according to ve-ha-Kabbalah, this Parasha has a lot to say about that phenomenon, patriotism and that sort of thing. So if you're with us on Kesher on Shabbos, stay for a few minutes after the Kiddush, and we'll see a passage from ve-ha-Kabbalah, which I think relates directly into that phenomenon of the conflict and the disputation with the rise of reform. In any case, we've seen tonight, just to summarize, I know our time is just about up, so to summarize, we've seen Avraham ha-Ivri, Abraham the Hebrew. It could mean that he's a descendant of Aver, which it does. It means that he is geographically from the Aver HaNahar, the other side of the river, but really those are only incidental. According to ve-ha-Kabbalah, the more profound reason is that theologically he was on one side and the rest of the world was on another side, as the lone monotheist of the generation or of the generations until his time. The second thing we said is that Harimosi Yadi, I lift up my hand as an oath, says Rashi, says ve-ha-Kabbalah, Harimosi Lashon Romamus Hashir, like we say in Kabbalah Shabbos. Romamu Hashem Elokeinu. So Romamu is an expression of Shir v'Shevach, song and praise. We said as well that another interpretation may mean Harimosi Yadi El Hashem. It would be as if I'm raising my hand in rebellion against God. If I were to take something from you, as if I'm putting my faith in man rather than in Hashem. And on the contrary, I am grateful that I don't have to take from you because Hashem has promised me, and I am relying on the assurance of Hashem. And then lastly, we said V'yagvo el hagar v'tahar, that happened very immediately in the first occasion, and this emerges directly from a close analysis of the Tameh HaMikra, in which all other instances of that sequence, the reference to the Lecha is the end of the pasuk, and the next verse says Vatahar, she conceived, etc. But it could have been weeks later, months later, we don't know when. So on this occasion, it happened, as we say, chick-chack immediately. And again, this emerges, according to ve-ha-Kabbalah, from a careful analysis. Thank you for joining us tonight. And we've just about finished on time, nearly. If there are any questions or comments, I'm happy to take them. And wish everybody Shabbat Shalom.